right, so a value returning function is not void. It has arguments. It can have one argument, zero arguments. The arguments are the same in value returning and void functions. Okay? So the arguments, formal and actual, same rules. Make sense? The difference between a value returning function is that it's not void, but instead it has what associated with it? And these are both in, but it has a type associated with it. So in the case of print lines, it was void. It doesn't return anything. You with me? Value returning does what? Returns a value. So the type associated with that function is the type of the value returned. If I'm going to return an int, the type is int. If I'm going to return a float, the type is float. If I'm going to return a char, it's char. Boolean, all these can be used for types of value returning functions. Does that make sense? Okay, so the deal with value returning is they're usually short and sweet. Because I told you that most value returning functions are what? Remember what I told you last week? Most value returnings are mathematical. Most value returning functions are mathematical. Not all, but many. Okay? So, in the case of cube, this guy takes the value and returns what? The cube of x. Okay? This was the problem we ended with, if you remember, last Thursday. And we pass in two numbers, and we determine which one's larger by placing it in max, and then the last line of this function returns max. Okay? Does everybody understand how to write a value returning function? So if I ask you to write a function called product, go ahead, try it. If I ask you to write a function called product, you give it the name product. You give it the type, let's assume int, we're doing int, so let's stick with int. And what would your arguments be? Two numbers coming in, x and y, num1, num2, whatever you want to do. The type would be, what type should product be if the two numbers coming in are integer? Integer, okay? So then, there's two ways we can write product. So we have int product. It has two numbers coming in. One way to write it, and it's up to you, whichever one you feel more comfortable with, is just to say return x times y. Okay? Another way, some people like this better. And what should I return here? Dip both, it's up to you, whatever you feel more comfortable with. There's not really an advantage or disadvantage of either one of these. Okay, so that's writing a value returning. They're easy, right? Short and sweet. They do the math, return the answer. The trick is calling a value returning function. Okay? So remember I was trying to remember the little ditty? I don't know if I have it in my notes or not. Found it, I think. Somewhere, not a good. Did I have it? Oh, I'm gonna have to add it to these notes. Such a brilliant. Multiple formal value return. Okay, well, I'm not finding it, but the way if we're going to call value return, we're going to do one of three things. We're going to store it, use it, or print it. Okay? Now let's look at what happens if I try to call it without doing that. So let's say that I just do this, product 1 comma 2. What's wrong with that call? What happens to the answer that I calculated? Nothing. It's lost in space effectively. It's sort of like saying 2 semicolons, right? Does everybody see the problem with calling a value returning function this way? Okay, well if you don't, let's try the next thing. So let's say instead, I say int p equals product of x and y. Now this time I'm calling product, I'm getting the answer, and storing the answer into another variable. So I'm storing it. Okay? The trick is, don't just call a value returning and don't do anything with it. Well, my answer is lost in space. Okay? Now the other option is to include it inside an expression. So the advantage is, I can plug this guy just like a mathematical function right inside an equation. Okay? And the answer will go right here, add b, and then store the thing in y. So I didn't have to do 2 steps. I didn't have to call it, put it somewhere, and then use it. So this is an example of using it. Storing it directly into a variable, using it inside an equation, or the last one is to print it directly. Does everybody see the difference between that and a void function, calling a void function? Does everybody see the difference between calling something like calculate sum, which is done, I do it standalone, versus plugging a value returning function call into something? Does that make sense? For some reason, initially people have trouble with it. Here's an example. When I put a formula into an Excel spreadsheet, what shows up? The answer. So that's the whole idea of using functions in programming. The function, a value returning function has an answer. We plug it in somewhere and it has a value. We just put a semicolon after it, it's lost. All right, now let me give you, before we move on from value returning, not all value returning are mathematical. Not all value returning are mathematical. I want you to try to write the following function. Is positive. Is positive. It has one argument. What type should that guy be? Boolean. Boolean. Okay? It has one argument of type integer, and it's going to return, if it's Boolean, it's going to return what? True or false. Okay? So go ahead and try to write it. We're writing is positive. The bool or Boolean? Okay. It started you here. Should be able to finish it, right? Okay. Let's pretend 0 is positive. Let's not worry about that for now. Okay. You know how to fill this in? Everybody should know how to fill this in, right? X is positive if what? Yeah, we're going to make it equal to also. Does that make sense? Okay, so that means answer equals true. Else, if it's not positive, answer equals false. And what does the last line of a value returning function have to do? Value returning, hint, hint, return that value, which in this case is and. So it's going to be, did everybody write this? If x is greater than or equal to 0, and equals true, else and equals false, return and. Okay, cool? Everybody knows how to write this value returning function. Yes? Question? Yeah.